we're going to be delving deeper into NDCs and NAPs. But talking about us, and the learning outcomes of this session, as previously indicated, we're going to be talking about national determined contributions and national adaptation plans, what they are, their definitions and significance in climate action, basically how you can align yourself. We are civil society, right? And we have varying programs and projects that are working towards community grassroots empowerment. And the importance, the role in global efforts to combat climate change, and the key policies that are associated or related to NDCs and NAPs. Where Botswana is falling behind, right? As Reol na strategy framework, a policy, we're going to be getting into those and where how we fit into the whole spectrum and how we can contribute or hold the relevant people accountable. And some examples of NDCs and NAPs, Botswana is not in a good place. Next slide, please. Oh, this is yours.
All right, so there was a colleague, friend of mine on my far right who did mention a bit about the Paris Agreement. So this is just to appreciate what this is all about. I mean, even though we can be talking about the national determining contributions, the NAPs and all that, where is it coming from? And this is basically it. How are we trying to work around this humongous problem that we're already facing, though a lot of people still see it as an emerging challenge that is coming in the future and not recognizing it as a present problem. And most importantly, how do we make sure that this problem reduces? I mean, you can already see how evident it is right now. The temperatures are skyrocketing, and there are already reports that are all saying that Botswana is going to be the country in Africa with the highest recorded temperatures. They're really that famous because of Mogote. So these are the kind of key points that we are trying to look at before we could even go as deep as NDCs and NAPs. This is what we are trying to talk about. The temperature. Finance, which is very important. We cannot do anything without finance. But as much as we're saying finance, who's supposed to be financing what? Who's supposed to be receiving the finance for what? Specialization in terms of the fact that there's a developed country, developing country, what are they supposed to be doing? Like, we can't all be doing the same thing. If, let's say, all of us you know, very bad example, but I hope you get it. And the emission goals, you know, we are thinking of 2050, that by then we'll be reduced the emissions and all that. We are talking about the net zero by 2050. And most importantly, burden sharing. We are now past the stage of saying so-and-so should be the one who's responsible. Country X is the one who's supposed to start doing something. We are now at a point where all of us are affected. We need to do something about it, whether we like it or not. Like, we're at a desperate stage, even though there are no alarms as yet. And the review mechanisms, the losses that we're already experiencing. I mean, if you have been going around Botswana, for example, we have had rains last year, and then within a month, and we have had a lot of farmers crying about how it's so dry that they don't know how they're going to feed their animals and stuff. Those are the losses that sometimes we undermine their impact because the issue of climate change so lightly. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Getting into specialization, I want to ask a question, Hela, just to make sure we're together. How do we feel, or how do you as an individual feel about this whole developing and developed countries who should be making contributions and things like that? I know it's a very heated topic, and not do anything because we are contributing to less than 4% as Africa, and then others are like, yeah, we push our agenda so that we're not left behind. There's a roving mic. Do you want to answer? Oh, okay.
Yes. Thank you. I think to me, developing countries should actually contribute more because they've already started, they've long time started to actually produce a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And again, not meaning that developing countries should just sit back, but at least because, like if you can give, for example, in some of the countries, they have got a lot of forests in most of, especially the equatorial regions. So those trees actually trap carbon dioxide, and so they have to be paid for them to keep that environment as it is. Hence a need for the developed countries to actually contribute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think society, like he was mentioning, the carbon sinks. Right, so starting with the NDCs, these are commitments that each country makes to reduce national emissions. Yaga, Rona, Botswana were fiscally reliant on coal, right? And what does that mean in terms of the NDCs? Nobody? Okay. And these communicate to the Paris Agreement targets, policies, measures of every parties, which is updated every 5 years to reflect to another increased ambition over time. So these commitments, Francistown, Kolo ya rona e pega ke 7-seat. Na ke na le 20 pula, right? Make it type of thing. Are we together? Remo. All right, next slide, please. Countries contribute to the goals of the Paris Agreement by setting up these targets to mitigate those emissions. And currently, we're trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, right? These plans define how we intend on reaching those targets by elaborating those systems we need to put in place to monitor and verify progress so that we stay on track. Despite this importance, we fall very far short. And I will speak on Botswana in the systems that we put in place. Not all relevant actors are involved. Next slide, please. Oh.
All right, so this basically is trying to show us the review processes when it comes to the NDCs. Excuse me. It first started with the Paris Agreement. Somebody did mention the Paris Agreement. That's like our Bible for climate change. And the first NDC was in 2016. So as a colleague was asking, is it the fifth one or what? This is what they were really looking at. So every 5 years, we do a reporting. Though in certain instances, actually they're trying to negotiate to say, why don't we do it every 2 years, because they feel like 5 years is too long. And you can guess who's basically suggesting that. And so because of all this, one of the critical elements called global stocktake was introduced. Basically what global stocktake is doing is to take stock of what's happening. Like we can keep saying, let's report, but who's having us accountable to see if if we are keeping on reporting, what if we are reporting the same thing over and over again? What if there's no progress? What if we are reporting but we really never got the kind of finances or funding that we require to be able to do our part for the NDC, so that the following reporting time we do report something substantial. So those are the reasons why the global stocktake was introduced, and it also happens every 5 years, as much as you can see that the second one will be in 2028. Though this year in 2024, there was something that was called the Global Stocktake Dialogue at the SBs in Germany. Next slide. So these are basically the NDC processes. When we say NDCs, as we had just mentioned, it starts with the Paris Agreement. That's the Bible of climate change. It has all the rules and laws, thou shalt not, or thou shalt, for climate change. All these rules were obviously set by every country, as much as the COP started as early as 1992. Up to 2015, they were probably coming up with those laws that we could continuously look at. So whatever decision that is being made, reference point has to be the Paris Agreement. And from there, they inform the nationally determined contributions. Now, these ones are tailor-made according to countries. You know, we cannot say, Botswana, for example, emission energy up to this much, there's a coal, you know, like, it shouldn't kill you, but it should help you get towards being better, you know, those kind of things. And from there, these are the determining factors when it comes to the NDCs. What either determines its progress in countries or not: capacity building, finances, institutional arrangement, which means basically also the stakeholders that are there, whether it's the academic, the CSOs, and all that. And most importantly, but we never talk about the political commitment. Sometimes the decisions that are made are more political and not really favoring the people. Technical assessment, implementation, which is also very critical. I know we usually say, but we don't implement well. Almost all countries do that, but it doesn't mean we have to sit down and say, everyone does it. So it's also very important, and it helps making sure that these NDCs processes are successful and leads to the achievement of the climate goals of the Paris Agreement, which is at first a max of 2 degrees, but making sure we limit it to 1.5. So we are now at a very critical stage that we're no longer saying 2 degrees, we're saying 1.5. Next slide, please. So this slide basically shows what the NDC processes mean at a national level versus at an international level. I know this is not too clear, but it already outlines what international level does and what the national level does. The policy formulation, for example, is something that is done at the national level. This is where each and every one of us plays a role, whether we realize it or not. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have consultation meetings, stakeholder mapping meetings, and all that. Like, for it to be a report that has to be done, each and every one of us has to be consulted. As Monana, what are you doing, or what do you feel has to be done for the relevant things to happen? That's how the policy is being formulated. But in most cases, we don't even realize that policy is being formulated and decision is made without our involvement. Most times, we don't even realize that all that happened because communication is a problem. I know we can already talk about the recent protesting that happened because the decision was made and we felt like people were never involved. And hence why, when it comes to climate advocacy, or let me just say youth advocacy, is very important because it helps you understand your role, because whatever decision that is going to be made and adopted by the country involves you, including capacity building. And in most decisions that are being made, or the texts that are being made, when it comes to youth, priority is always capacity building, not just but that you may be capacitated to also teach other people, especially the intergenerational kind of teaching, where some things are better understood by young people because of the changes. So, yeah. And then from decision making, the implementation, this is where also we have to play a role. Like when there is an NDC or there is a law or a policy that has been made, this is where we should be taking part of it in making sure that the laws are practical. For example, Botswana has good policies, but in most cases, we fail at implementation, which means it's a gap. And sometimes because it's a gap, we don't realize and fight hard for it to be met or to be covered so much that we end up missing the very same opportunity that we should be having to be able to make that kind of decision or impact, sorry, not decision. Yes. So from implementation is evaluation. This is also where youth or all of us have to play a role, because we have to look back and say, this is how we want Botswana to be like. If we remember, climate change is not just affecting us now, but tomorrow. imagine our highest temperature this year is, let me say, 45. How do you think it's going to be like when it's 55? How do you think our cattle, even Rona hell, how do you think we're going to be able to live without in that kind of temperature? Do you think we'll be all affording aircons even for animals? If the answer is no, then what does that mean about us as young people who are believing that we'll be, you know, like not just for the future, but for now, the kind of decision makers, business people, that also just becomes as realistic as possible for all of us in that instance. Next slide. I hope that made sense.
Okay, great. So speaking on to that whole process, one may wonder why Botswana is really there on successful implementation policies. In terms of engaging the relevant actors and stakeholders, we fall short in terms of monitoring and evaluation, transparency and accountability. We have a tendency of calling people when we're formulating policies, but somewhere along the line it gets political and we drop off the civil society and the grassroots communities. So we have Nepal, Grenada, and Mongolia. These are the ones that we had identified having successful NDC implementations because they use data and evidence to set clear short and medium-term emission targets. Do you know the same thing? Somewhere, but it's not based on anything. This is what we're talking about, that decisions need to be made or policies need to be developed based on data and evidence. Grenada has received support from the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub because they showed the progress from beginning formulation, evaluation, validating. We were still keeping that same stakeholders throughout. Then Mongolia was actively creating an enabling environment for public-private initiatives to move towards low carbon direction, meaning that as we're engaging on these policies, it's not just for government, it's not just for civil society. We need to involve your banks, your industries, so that we're all moving in a unified approach. The tips for successful implementation is having those long-term strategies to avoid locking in climate incompatible infrastructure, having desk reviews, to having that feedback to identify and cost the sub-actions with each action, and effective governance. Next slide, please. Great, that's all we have for NDCs. Do we have any questions? Okay, we'll take questions at the end. Are we together? Okay, great. Moving on to national adaptation plans. Next slide, please. So NAPs are strategic frameworks developed by countries to address the adaptation needs to reduce vulnerabilities of the impacts of climate change. Like Anto had said, the highest temperature is going to be 45 degrees. In as much as we are intending on moving to climate smart agriculture, even that is not sustainable for that kind of weather. The building so that the shade net or like that polythene material for your tunnels doesn't erode. Next slide, please. And their role is to assess the country's readiness and assist in planning for future in terms of climate action, to track their progress and assist in improving on their adaptation plans, and mainly to reduce vulnerabilities or to the impacts. And that kind of information, you can only have a better understanding or knowledge by engaging communities, getting out there, engaging youth, and understanding what it is they need and want for the future. Next slide, please.
Okay, so at this point, I'll be talking about the NEP processes. If you remember from the NDCs, I talked about those processes, how it starts with the Bible, and then they are there, then there are those finances, those processes that are also involved, like finances. I talked about capacity building and all that. So starting off with this one, with the NEP, well, the NEP was actually established before the Paris Agreement. And what they really wanted to do, or what we really wanted to do, was to make sure that adaptation there's a reporting on adaptation because, well, almost every country is trying to adapt anyway. So the plan was to be as simple as possible, but making sure that every country has its own role played. And it started in 2010, went on to the guidance developed at 2013, all the way to the global network that was established in 2014 and now incorporated in the Paris Agreement at 2015. Remember, Paris Agreement was formalized or implemented or stem back at 2015. And then from there, that's when the Green Climate Fund was released. So the Green Climate Fund is like banca, adaptation. Everything that has to do with adaptation, projects that are there. Almost every country has at least had something from that fund. And today we are now at the progress of formulation and implementation of NEPs. Maybe I could just highlight it as a bit of an assignment for all of us to see how is our Botswana, how far is it in the processes. But with time, we'll also look at that. Next slide. So this is the NEP processes. It first starts with the groundwork, the ABCDs, the groundwork. This is all about trying to establish what's happening, making assessments, seeing the vulnerable places. And then you get to the preparatory elements where you now prepare from just the kind of information that you have. Then from preparation, you get to the next step of implementation. So the groundwork and those gaps that are identified as well as the preparatory elements, that's all planning. And that's the only thing that Botswana has done that when it comes to accessing even money, because all these processes, you have certain kind of funds set aside for you to access. So Botswana has only prepared not yet with the implementation stages, strategies, and the reporting and monitoring. So in the middle, those are enabling factors. When it comes to planning, implementation, and M&E. Again, finances, institutional arrangements, that also includes the stakeholders, academia, boronayan, capacity development, information sharing, which is also very important. In most cases, we don't even realize that some of the funds that are there are just part of the NEP processes or are there to be, like Yes. Next slide. So this is more in detail and a bit more specific on how it goes back to us as Botswana. Remember the 4 ABCDs from laying groundwork, preparation, implementation, M&E. Now from there, going to the other side, that's all the implementation phase. What would have been expected of us? But remember, Botswana has not yet gotten to the implementation stage, despite all these processes being there for like a while. So these are some of the implementation adaptation actions: water, agriculture, infrastructure, the weather in terms of, those systematic, early warning, planning, Madi, forestry, capacity development as well, which is very important. Whatever you do, every stage you have to be capacitated. Not just capacitating people, but also the people that are going to capacitate have to be capacitated because knowledge keeps revolving. Next slide. So this one now tries to explain, I hope it's a bit visible to you, where we fall, which is very important. As much as we can talk about the NEPs and NDCs, if we don't realize the kind of impact we are contributing, indirectly or indirectly, silently or ignorantly, it will be useless because then it means we won't do our part, which is quite important. So in this slide, it shows the kind of processes and levels on who makes the decision. For example, we are down there, but we're very important. The public, the civil society, the private sector. you can put the youth there as well. We are the ones who are to be making sure that the public and the civil society has feedback on the plans. And we also have to influence the ministries and departments in making sure that they conduct activities that produce those NEP plans. And then the committees, the national committees, like for example, who knows the Climate Change Committee? Or at least one person who knows about it. Or when it was made. Do you know there's a new committee now? So that one also integrates the sectoral plan into implementation. We are, by virtue, supposed to know who the committee is. If we make these kind of decisions, let's say from here we are coming up with a position paper. We need to know who we are taking that position paper to, how they should listen to us, especially when there's so much power in numbers. This is how we know what level, at a national, what kind of influence we can do, other than just going straight to the parliament. Before it goes straight to the parliament, even policies, strategies, and all that, before they make it to the parliament, people have to be consulted, and then it goes to the department, they have to do it, bring the stakeholders to make all those important things. So even with the NEP processes, for us to understand what kind of adaptation plans and processes that have to happen in Botswana, whether how they are being affected by climate change, that all plays a huge role that needs to be recognized. Next slide. Yes, still going into the processes. Now, one of the things that we should also bear in mind, I'm sorry, I can see it's not clear. I hope it doesn't make you sleepy, especially after lunch. Just to try and show you that from this kind of process, there is a hands-on training and institutional support that has to stand out. The support has to bring capacity building and M&E in every stage, whether it's the laying of groundwork, the preparatory elements, the implementation, the reporting. Every stage has to have the kind of capacity building. And guess what? That already is a gap, an opportunity for us young people to take advantage of. If we are to be capacitated, we would be the ones dealing with the capacity, making sure that there's that kind of capacity building for all stakeholders. You remember the previous slides, all those different sectors, the climate change, the parliament, and all that. That's an opportunity for us young people to be able to capacitate them. Capacity does not have to come from up to down. Sometimes it goes up, especially looking at the fact that we are the ones who are mostly affected. And also the climate services and systematic data are the ones that also influence all these kind of processes. Next slide. I hope it makes sense. Are we okay? All right.
Thank you, Anto. Sorry about that. We understand the processes. As she had mentioned, monitoring and evaluation at each and every stage is a more at the end. Stakeholder engagement, the private sector, civil society, grassroots communities. Most importantly, it should be gender responsive. It should engage participation and transparency, systematic adaptation goals supported by science. In the next slide, we'll be delving into some of the examples of successful NAP implementations. Next slide, please. They've managed to cover all of these. Azerbaijan has 3 outcomes, both of them. They have improved data availability. We had mentioned it, liquid NDCing, the use of data and science, access and sharing for decision making. Hakisora, have you realized that how's anako ministry what policy you are told is not there, or you have to go to some department? How many of us have easy access to the policies that are available? What's on? No one. Yeah. So that's that. And that's an opportunity as well for us as youth to try and centralize that. Enhanced institutional and technical capacity for climate change adaptation in water, agriculture, and coastal areas. That's what Azerbaijan is where we're having COP in 3 weeks. Yeah. The third outcome is increased mainstreaming of climate change adaptation considerations into planning at national, regional, local levels in the key priority sectors. Moving on to Benin, the economic and climate impacts are assessed and adaptation options prioritized for effective budgeting and planning. It's highly informed by what they have gathered being the impacts of climate and economic. And the second one being climate change adaptation mainstreaming into budgeting processes. It's on a but where that budgeting is facilitated. Then they have the National Environmental Climate Fund is strengthened to attract public and private funding for effective adaptation planning. Why is it that all these funds, you can never find Botswana there? Because the planning phase. Next slide, please. We're moving now into national and local policies tsa Botswana. Next slide. Right. We have the Climate Change Acts or laws. NDP, as we may be aware, we're on NDP 12. That should embed climate action within a broader perspective and incorporating other aspects of development, such as social economy. Yeah, Garle, a fiscally reliant country on fossil fuels, but having that understanding, certain agreements where we're reducing emissions. What does that mean in terms of how we are going to be restructuring our infrastructure? How we are going to be, that is your railroad, I get a. And then we should have sector-specific policies, energy, agriculture, water, health policies, and these should not be parallel to each other, as we see happening in most cases. Mon. Next slide, please. In order for us to achieve these overall goals, there needs to be integration of climate strategies into local development planning, the NDP, and governance frameworks. So these need to be more localized to reflect specific regional needs and driven by local knowledge and addressing specific vulnerabilities linked to NAP objectives, meaning that we cannot have a blanket approach. Up north, yes, we're having drought, but where we have more water bodies, tourism, how can we tailor these policies and acts and laws to suit them specifically? How do we align our budget to socio-economic ways? Next slide, please. And key policies supporting NDCs and NAPs. For mitigation-focused policies, we have the renewable energy policy that aligns with NDC targets through to reduce emissions through the just transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. We have the conservation policies or acts that is aimed at preventing deforestation. And then there's the energy efficiency standards that promote energy efficiency in industries. Are we aware of all of these? Partly. All right, thanks. And then in terms of adaptation, we have the DRR strategies that enhance the resilience of climate-induced disasters like floods and droughts. Last time I checked, I think about 1.5. Imagine and you need to adapt from that. Is 1.5 enough to cover for that? At 1.5, I stand to be corrected. Pula. Yes, 1,500 pula. All right. And then we have water management policies to support adaptive measures. Then there's the agriculture adaptation plans that focus on climate-smart agriculture to reduce those vulnerabilities. But what can you do with a tunnel? Next slide, please. Case study, yeah, Botswana. We have the North-South Water Carrier Water Transfer Project. We have the drought relief programs and some practice initiatives that climate-smart agriculture. Then we have the GCF Fund Ecosystem It's based on adaptation and mitigation in Botswana's communal rangelands to restore vegetation in Kwa, impacted by climate change, and to reduce GG over 8.5 years. Next slide, please. Yes, that's yours.
Next slide. So in summary, this is just basically all about NDCs and NEPs. What brings them together is the Paris Agreement. If you know what the Paris Agreement is all about, it's reducing emissions, but also learning to adapt to climate change. And this is how they end up coming back together. Dia berekisan as of 2015, so that it doesn't become like two independent things that are working but not coming together. So this is how they come together. NDCs are more about working with mitigation and adaptation at the same time. Mitigation to try and reduce the emissions, and to do with the adaptation. And then adaptation on the other side, it has those NEP processes, if you remember the ABCDs from groundwork, preparation, implementation, and reporting, and they keep working together like this. The only difference is the NEP processes hadina mo go teng bo 5 years go submit, though it's supposed to be there. And it's kind of quite interesting that Botswana ga ise submit the SIP. But it's a question that she also asked, Matata Hagai. Maybe we could also ask ourselves that question as we go to the Q&A. Just also to finalize and say, this is the National Climate Change Policy Governance works around all these. The NDCs and the adaptation, they inform the policy governance and the National Transparency Framework. And all this then informs the reporting that has to be done at the UNFCCC. So when we are doing the negotiations, what we basically negotiate for are the terms and conditions around all this and how it affects all of us. Next slide. I hope that was clear. Now we can have the Q&A. Let's go. Any questions?
And if they don't have questions, we'll ask the questions.
Mic check. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I was actually looking forward to this one. Kilibile the lineup throughout the entire day. And I'm happy that it met a lot of expectations. I think it would have been nice as well, in addition, to appreciate Rona within our NDCs, what commitments has our government laid. I know there was in the initial ones it spoke to around 30%, or no, is it 30 or 15, somewhere around 15, right? 15% of the 2010 baseline, I think, something like that. Then Haruka explanation from government, it was like they are planning to increase emissions, then make them die down after 2030, because that clarity would be quite useful. And I also want to weigh in on what has been done. So in this case, I'll speak representing or coming from the side Global Water Partnership. Unfortunately, I can't say that we have done work that directly comes from government, getting funds from Jeff, but we are working with transboundary organizations that work within these countries, including Botswana. For instance, we have a Jeff-funded project that is currently ongoing in Mokgobane that we are doing. We have some of our people on site there doing the project, and it's part of adaptations. But of course, like I'm saying, you'd find the financing was accessed by the transboundary organizations, not necessarily the government, but we could sort of say it is representing the government because we are working in part with government. So Yeah. Then that was a comment. Then probably the last one. It would be nice as well just to get to appreciate the policies, the specific ones. I was seeing as you were giving examples of the mitigation and adaptation, they were a bit broad. You're speaking to climate acts and policies. So I would like to appreciate the progress that we've done. Like I was saying, we have with respect to NEP, since we hosted the NEP Expo in 2022, we had the framework. I wanted to appreciate beyond that framework, is there anything else that we have done? Is there a NEP policy or guidelines or something like that? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the comments. I think actually I was gonna talk about the NEP Expo, I forgot. But that's a very good question, a very good comment, because yes, we did host the NEP Expo in 2022, but it still is baffling for the fact that even though we have hosted it, we still do not have anything that we have submitted. We're still very much lagging behind. You know, if you remember from the 2 examples that we gave, imagine, is there anyone who's not a Botswana here? Benin. It's a Benin. So sometimes, yes, the processes themselves demand a lot from the country, so much. Perhaps the government ends up saying, you know what, we'll find ways of hata madi from our budget. Sometimes the terms and conditions are very big, and it makes the process very slow and difficult to try and get into. But nonetheless, we should at least be heading the processes, especially that we have already, you know, hosted the NEP Expo. I mean, if you have hosted something as big as that, you'd be feeling like you are very exemplary. I'm not ill-speaking our country. I'm just saying we could do much better. But such kind of examples are very important, the transboundary projects, and as well as the ones that we have talked about. I know that when it comes to Botswana, we like gloating so much about the North-South Korea, even though Batwanzarai project is selling nothing. You know, those kind of things, it's also up to us to try and see, even in our individual lives or wherever we are, how can we come up together to try and make sure we help our country to be able to do our part. And as much as we might sometimes think I'm just nobody or I'm just one person, if we are 20, we can do as much difference as much as you saw how the protest had few people, but there was so much impact. Yes. Any other question? There are some questions in front.
Let me add to, while we're waiting for the other questions, to add to your water partnership, and for the nuances you're saying, it's a private, more or less like a private thing, but you can't exactly say government. I think Botswana is one of the few countries where they have an open door policy. You can get to see DPS, PS, and have that engagement. It's also a form of advocacy. Advocacy is not just holding up placards, but also seeing how you can align your efforts for that kind of recognition, and not having, I think sometimes you have a tendency of pointing fingers and forgetting that the other 4 are pointing back at us. So where you're seeing that gap and challenge, kind of figure out where, how you can address it. Rather have someone at the office saying, "Hangai ga go thusa," than saying, "Hey, harasho gore janjang."
Can I just, not to make it a dialogue, just to run on that quick. Yeah, just to clarify on that one, I didn't speak of it in terms of probably the government is not doing enough. It's just for us to also be able to appreciate that the government might be working through some of these agencies. I remember during the NEP Expo, one of the major issues was that African governments are unable to get access to funds from climate mechanisms, or funding mechanisms, rather. Why? Because they don't have experts on ground to help them meet those many requirements. And it is through some of our organizations that we get to do these, because we meet national development goals, the governments meet national development goals through these technical partners, implementation partners, and transboundary partners. Where the effort should be in us having to find a way to account for all these actions that are done by different entities so that they are all reported as one in the government of Botswana.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think while the other person is asking the question, it goes back to the part that if we all can come together and try and do something, we can decentralize everything from the government. The government is just meant to facilitate things, not to do everything. And maybe that's where we need to really rise up as young people.
Thank you. So mine is a question when it comes to the national adaptation plans that I didn't really see much talking about health. So I just wanted to know what, like the intersection between climate change and health, what is it that we have planned for us to, in terms of adaptations as a country going forward? Because we're seeing now globally that a lot of countries are going into health as well as education, looking into rural areas and different kinds of health, global health, such as HIV and sexual reproductive health when it comes to getting or having access to young people, especially adolescent girls and young women.
Yes, so to answer that question, health is one of the sectors that has been sort of undermined. You'll be so shocked that it was only up to COP28 that health had a section in the whole COP28 calendar, which shows that it really needs to be given much attention. But just maybe to add on to that, it does not mean there are not projects, there are no projects that are already going. I know WHO is already having some climate and health projects that are there. Just by virtue of the fact that we do not write them here or recognize them does not mean they are not there. But yes, it's very important, like I keep saying, all of us have some burning issue that we need to be addressed. And if we come together and try and make sure that we do our part without having to ask, you know, like making sure that we also do our part.
Thank you. My question kind of is an extension of what he had previously shared. I think it also kind of extends to what you just shared just now. I think I would particularly like to get a better understanding of, as someone not actively perhaps in this space, how do we as industry support organizations such as yours within the space? Because my understanding is, as you shared in your presentation, you said sometimes where Botswana kind of gets stuck in is the planning phase and we never move on to implementation. So for example, where the space that I'm in is around delivery and implementation, but because, let's say, for example, the jargon doesn't necessarily speak directly to me, I may not have the awareness of how can we be able to actually support where we can. So I would like that understanding, like where do we meet to be able to assist you guys to do that?
Okay, that's a very good question. I'll also give an example of how I did mention I'm part of the COP negotiations, but by law, anyone who's not from the government is not supposed to negotiate. In other words, what I'm trying to say is sometimes there are gaps. It's easy to take advantage of them, but not in a way that you end up breaking the law entirely. And you said a very good question, and I think he answered you when he was talking about himself from the, I think, NGO space or the private sector space. I stand to be corrected. That as much as we have so much opportunities, we need to also find ways of helping the government decentralize everything from them so that we can be able to play the very important roles. Like there's so much gap and there's so many opportunities that individuals, organizations can do, but unfortunately we cannot do it to certain length unless if the government allows. And sometimes it means going to Toya or dancing too much around the government for them to let you be. And it's very important because when such kind of decisions are made, or even in the preparatory stage, a lot of consultants are brought in. And guess where most of the time the consultants are coming from? You can answer for that, yourself for that. But if we were to be able to rise up in a way that we could at least, if at all they still don't trust us, work with those consultants, we could actually achieve a lot and be able to move. And like I've also said, one of the reasons why we have not moved to the implementation stages, sometimes you find that the terms and conditions dikana. And when you are as a government, you think of going through all that, you know what, which is not fair. But what can be done if at all the conditions are very difficult? While in the same space, negotiators and everyone in the high level is trying to negotiate for the country to have better opportunities to that. I hope I answered your question.
Let me just quickly add on to that. I think having these kind of platforms also kind of helps to raise awareness and bringing in all the different partners that are involved in the process. I think we really do appreciate also having your presence here.
No, thank you so much. I think you have. Okay. Oh, I think
time is gone, so ask fast before they stop asking.
the time is.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. I think what I wanted to actually touch on is that as Botswana, since we are upper class economy country, and that thing is one of the issues that actually upper middle class income country, and that thing is also a negative in terms of us sourcing for funds from these organizations that you have been talking about. So it's really part of what we should now do is that you find out that the government is now taking some of the activities which were supposed to be done through those international donors, now doing it with the normal budget that the government is sharing with other entities, right? And one of the issues that I've picked up when doing the NEP and other things is that I don't know how the representation in these forums are being selected, but you find out that decision making, there's too much over delegation from other entities when decisions are being taken. And at the end of the day, we sound as if an organization was not represented because the level of representation in those forums, they actually, they are and these are the top decision makers. Because I can foresee that I happen to be part of the NEP and I happen to be part of the strategy for climate change. I happened to go to negotiations. At one point, I was trained to negotiate. And again, the policy for climate change, I was part of it. But because of this, next time again, next time is the gentleman here, and this gentleman who comes in, even the document, you start from zero, and there's no back and forth. And we end up coming up with strategies. Of course, we may sound as if they're okay, they're well crafted, but when you look at some of those, you can see that these strategies are not fair enough. We cannot implement those because they have some too much English, yes, in specific to what we want to do. Thank you.
I think to answer to your middle income, yes, it does give us a negative impact to accessing funds. She had mentioned she's part of the negotiations. I'm a climate justice advocate and gender equality change maker. So I come in as the civil society perspective. And what we advocate for is when these funds are being developed, they should be made in such a way that they're not specified to governments. Civil societies should get access, not just, and to try and break those barriers for accessibility to the people who are on the front line.
But I wanted to just say, you are very right. I think maybe the problem is us also. Like, if you point 1, 3 are already pointing at us. It's up to us to also try and make sure we do our best. I'll also maybe encourage you that tomorrow there will be some negotiation mock tomorrow, and I'll also be talking about the negotiations. Maybe you could come and then we can see if we can continue the conversation there. But Hela, if we're to leave you with the last words, by all means, there are gaps that are there to be filled. Sometimes we don't realize it because we don't know. You know how they say sometimes what you don't know won't hurt you. In this case, it's hurting us. So if we could try and make sure we get so much active in the space that we collaborate and be able to access these funds. Sometimes these funds are really available for almost everyone. It's just that we don't realize. And sometimes the terms and conditions are so steep that you really have to work hard for, and you keep going and keep going. So I'm just hoping that we'll keep going and keep going, so that it will be better than nothing anyway. Thank you.